December 25, 1942. Somewhere in the Libyan desert west of El Agheila, the most feared general in the world is sitting in an open staff car, bouncing across a flat expanse of hard-packed sand and scrub. Brush, his goggles pushed up on his forehead. The Afrika Korps suntan, fading on a face carved by 2 years of desert wind. The temperature at midday can still reach 90 degrees. The nights can drop below freezing. And Erwin Rommel, Field Marshal, Knight's Cross at his throat, the man Churchill called a great general on the floor of the House of Commons, is hunting for his Christmas dinner, not planning the next offensive, not reviewing supply manifests, not writing to Berlin. He is trying to shoot a gazelle, not with a hunting rifle. He doesn't have one. He is using his service pistol, a 9mm sidearm designed to kill enemy soldiers at close range, fired from a moving vehicle at an animal, built by evolution to outrun lions. When a herd breaks across the scrub ahead of him, he raises the pistol and fires. He doesn't miss. He wrote about it himself in the same set of letters and diary entries that would later be edited into the book known as the Rommel Papers. The detail is almost too strange to absorb. The Desert Fox, the terror of the British Eighth Army, shooting gazelles from a car with his combat pistol on Christmas Day. But if you look carefully at what was happening to Rommel's army in December 1942, the image stops being strange and becomes something else entirely. It becomes a portrait of collapse, dressed up in the cape of a legend. If you want to understand Erwin Rommel, you have to start before Africa. You have to go back to a classroom in Württemberg, Germany, in the 1890s, to the son of a schoolteacher and a military family. A boy who showed no particular signs of genius but possessed her quality that would define his entire life. He simply would not stop until the problem in front of him was solved. He was born on November 15, 1891, in the town of Heidenheim. His father taught mathematics. His mother came from a family of civil servants. Erwin was not a prodigy. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest. But from the moment he entered the German military academy in 1910, something became clear. Rommel experienced battle differently than other men. Where others saw confusion, he found clarity. Where others waited for orders, he moved. He proved this for the first time in World War I, on the Italian front in 1917, during the Battle of Caporetto. Leading a small mountain force through terrain the Italians considered impassable, he maneuvered through fog, cold, and chaos, and captured an entire enemy division, roughly 10,000 men, with a force a fraction of that size. For this action, he received Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite, known as the Blue Max. He was 26 years old. Between the wars, Rommel wrote, he distilled what he had learned into a book called Infantry Attacks, published in 1937. It reached Adolf Hitler, who read it carefully and recognized in it the kind of aggressive, instinct-driven tactical thinking he wanted at the top of his army. When the war began, Hitler gave Rommel something no German officer of his rank would normally receive: command of a panzer division in France, a posting that required bypassing the usual promotional queue. Some senior officers never forgave him for it. Rommel didn't particularly care. In France in 1940, he drove his 7th Panzer Division so fast and so far ahead of everyone else that his own headquarters frequently lost contact with him. The division became known as the Ghost Division. It moved like smoke, appearing where least expected, advancing distances that seemed impossible. He crossed the River Meuse under fire, went forward in an assault boat himself, drove through the night when others stopped. By the time France fell, he had covered more ground and taken more prisoners than almost any other commander in the campaign. And Hitler had plans for him. By early 1941, the situation in North Africa had become what German planners delicately called a problem. Italy had invaded British Egypt in September 1940 with an army of 10 divisions and been driven back in 10 weeks, losing 130,000 men as prisoners to a British and Commonwealth force less than a third their number. The Italian position in Libya was crumbling. For Hitler, who needed Italy in the war and needed the Mediterranean contested, this was unacceptable. The solution arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, Erwin Rommel, now a lieutenant general, stepped off a transport plane to find Italian officers, packing their bags and enlisted men throwing away their weapons to make room in trucks for their personal belongings. He spent exactly 1 day assessing the situation. Then he ordered the available German units to move, not to defend, not to wait for reinforcements, but to attack. This was, to put it mildly, outside his orders. He had been sent to hold a defensive line. He attacked instead. He drove the British back across hundreds of miles of desert, all the way to the Egyptian frontier in weeks. The British, who had been reading German signals through their Enigma code-breaking operation, had believed the German build-up would take months. They were wrong about this particular German. In the process, Rommel established a pattern that would define the entire North African campaign. Move faster than the enemy expects. Strike where they don't expect you. Rely on your judgment even when it contradicts the plan. He led from the front, appeared at crisis points before anyone called for him, and possessed what the Germans called Fingerspitzengefühl and fingertip feeling, an almost physical instinct for where a battle was about to turn. His opponents started calling him the Desert Fox. German propaganda turned him into something close to a god. But there was a problem with the legend that was forming around Erwin Rommel, and the problem was logistical. And in the world of modern mechanized warfare, logistics is not a footnote. Logistics is everything. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We cover the real history behind the military legends, and today's story is one of the most revealing you'll find. Now back to that question. Why was Rommel shooting gazelles with his service pistol instead of a hunting rifle? The answer on its surface seems almost too simple. Because he didn't have a hunting rifle. He was a field marshal in a combat zone, operating from open staff cars and reconnaissance vehicles, rarely staying in any location more than a few days. The weapon on his hip was whatever his army issued to its officers in North Africa. In late 1942, that was most likely a Walther pistol of some kind, possibly the service P-38 or the more compact PPK that German officers favored for its compactness. But here is where the question gets more interesting. Because Rommel wasn't simply improvising with what was available. What he was doing and raising a pistol from a moving vehicle and firing accurately at a running gazelle required a specific set of skills: spatial awareness, timing, trigger, control, the ability to calculate a lead angle in motion. These were not hunting skills. They were combat skills translated into the act of putting food on a table. And why was Rommel hunting for food at all? Because his army was running out of everything. The story of the North African campaign is often told as a story of generalship. Rommel versus Auchinleck, Rommel versus Montgomery, a chess match in the sand. But the real story, the one that determined the outcome before a single tank fired its main gun, was the story of a supply line 400 miles long across a desert with one usable road. Rommel's forces in North Africa required roughly 70,000 tons of supplies per month to sustain operations. These supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, had to cross the Mediterranean by ship, arrive at the ports of Tripoli or Benghazi on the Libyan coast, and then be transported by truck across the Via Balbia, the single hard-surfaced road that ran from Tripoli to the Egyptian frontier. When Rommel's forces were at the gates of El Alamein in Egypt, his supplies were being unloaded at ports more than 1,000 miles behind him. The arithmetic was punishing. German Major General F.W. von Mellenthin, who served in North Africa, described it plainly in his account of the campaign. Getting supplies from Tripoli to the front required so much fuel for the truck convoys themselves that the effective yield at the front was a fraction of what was loaded at the port. By some estimates, delivering 1 liter of fuel to the forward positions required 7 liters, burned in transit, and that was on a good day. The British, operating from their island base at Malta, in the middle of the Mediterranean, were systematically sinking the Italian merchant ships that carried Axis supplies across the sea. In October 1942 alone, British submarines and aircraft sank multiple Axis tankers, including vessels specifically loaded with fuel. There were weeks when no fuel at all reached the forward positions. Rommel knew this. He wrote about it obsessively in his letters to His wife Lucy. He spoke of the supply problem as the invisible enemy, the one he could not outmaneuver no matter how brilliant his battlefield decisions. He noted the irony in his Christmas journal, accepting a small drum of captured British coffee as a gift from his men. A commander who understood that captured coffee was more valuable to his army than any decoration Berlin could offer. The gazelle he shot that Christmas was not a sport hunt. It was food. The Afrika Korps, the most romanticized fighting force of the Second World War, was scavenging the desert for protein. Let's talk about that pistol for a moment, because it matters more than it might seem. The standard German officer's sidearm in 1942 was the Walther P-38, a 9mm semi-automatic that had been adopted by the Wehrmacht in 1938 to replace the famous Luger PE-08. The Luger was a precision instrument, beautifully engineered, accurate and almost impossibly expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. The Wehrmacht P-38 kept the Luger's cartridge and basic performance, but could be produced in roughly half the time for a fraction of the cost. Over the course of the war, more than 1.2 million P-38s were manufactured. Many German officers also carried the smaller Walther PPK, the same pistol James Bond would later make famous, which was more compact and preferred by those who spent time in confined spaces like tank turrets and aircraft cockpits. What these weapons shared was a design purpose: close-range combat. The P-38 was effective at ranges up to about 50 meters in skilled hands. The PPK was designed for even shorter distances. Neither was a weapon you would choose for hunting if you had any other option. Rifles, the Karabiner 98K that the German infantry carried, were accurate at several hundred meters. A rifle fired from a stationary position at a stationary target is a completely different proposition from a pistol fired from a moving vehicle at a running animal. That Rommel could do this accurately is consistent with what we know of him. He was not a man who sat behind a map table. He was in the field, in the vehicles, at the front, in conditions that required constant physical skill. But the choice of weapon reveals the circumstance. He was working with what he had. Field Marshal of the German Reich, hunting Christmas dinner with his service. Sidearm from the back of a staff car, because a hunting rifle would have been a luxury he didn't need and couldn't justify. The interpreter who accompanied him, a man named Armbruster, also managed to hit one. 2 gazelles, 2 pistols, 1 moving car, 1 Christmas afternoon. In the broader context of the North African campaign, this small scene contains more truth than most official histories. By Christmas 1942, Rommel was already a man in retreat. The decisive moment had come in late October and early November, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, and it had come in the way Rommel had always feared it would. Not through a brilliant enemy maneuver, not through some tactical masterstroke he failed to anticipate, but through weight. Bernard Montgomery, the new commander of the British Eighth Army, had spent months rebuilding his force after the humiliations of 1941 and 1942. He had received fresh tanks, American-built Shermans and Grants that could match or outperform most of what Rommel had. He had received ammunition and fuel in quantities that dwarfed what the Axis could put ashore. He had received time, which the supply lines across the Mediterranean had denied. To Rommel at every critical moment, when Montgomery attacked on the night of October 23, 1942, he attacked with 700 tanks. Rommel had perhaps 200 serviceable panzers and a comparable number of older, more vulnerable Italian tanks. More critically, Rommel had almost no fuel. In the days before the battle, British aircraft and submarines had again sunk key Axis tankers. On the morning Montgomery's artillery opened fire, over 900 guns, the largest British artillery barrage since World War I, Rommel was in Germany, sick, recalled for medical treatment. He flew back as soon as word reached him that the battle had begun. He would not leave his men, but there was nothing a general's presence could do about the arithmetic. By early November, Montgomery had broken through. Rommel, with barely 26 serviceable tanks left and almost no fuel, began the longest retreat of the Desert War. Fighting withdrawal that would cover more than 1,500 miles from El Alamein, all the way to Tunisia. The Christmas hunt on the Libyan plain was part of that retreat. Rommel had pulled back to Alamein, the same stretch of wasteland, where he had launched his first offensive nearly 2 years before. The desert he had conquered was behind him now. The British were coming, steadily and with adequate supply, and the desert fox was hunting gazelles with a pistol. What makes Rommel's story genuinely tragic, in the classical sense of a tragedy, where the flaw is inseparable from the greatness, is that he understood his situation with perfect clarity and said so. In his letters to his wife, and in the notes that would become the Rommel papers, he wrote with extraordinary candor about the supply crisis, about the impossibility of sustaining an offensive at the end of a 400-mile supply line, about the futility of being asked to reach the Suez Canal without the logistical base to support such an advance. He repeatedly circumvented orders from both Hitler and Mussolini, not out of disloyalty, but because he understood that the orders were militarily absurd. Stand and fight to the last man, with 26 tanks and no fuel. He would not murder his men for a theater performance of defiance. What he couldn't change was the strategic situation. North Africa was not the priority for Germany's war effort in 1942. The Eastern Front was consuming everything. Hitler's heart was in Russia. The Mediterranean was Mussolini's theater, and Mussolini's navy controlled the supply lines across it. Rommel, the most gifted tactical commander of his generation, was fighting a war that his own side had never fully committed to winning. This is the bitter irony of the Desert Fox legend. His brilliance made the African campaign look like a near-run thing. In reality, it was almost never close. The Allies always had more of everything that ultimately mattered. Rommel, to his credit, knew this. He fought anyway with the resources he had, trying to make tactical genius compensate for strategic neglect. And for 2 years in the wasteland between Tripoli and Cairo, it almost worked. There is one more thing worth understanding about Erwin Rommel, that the legend tends to obscure, and it matters for how we judge him. He was not a political man in the Nazi sense. He was not a member of the party. There is no documented evidence that he personally ordered war crimes. Indeed, he refused explicit orders to execute Jewish prisoners and British commandos captured behind enemy lines, stating that they were soldiers performing their duty and deserved to be treated as such. The Afrika Korps fought what he called, in his own words, a war without hate, a phrase that historians have rightly scrutinized, because no war is truly fought without hate, and there were certainly crimes committed in his theater. But Rommel himself was not the architect of them. He was, at his core, a soldier from an earlier tradition, a man who believed that the purpose of war was to defeat an enemy's army, not to destroy its civilians, and who found the ideological machinery of the regime he served genuinely alien to his professional values. By 1944, after watching Hitler's decisions destroy the armies he had tried to save in Africa, and then again in Normandy, Rommel had arrived at a conclusion he could no longer avoid. The war was lost, and Hitler was leading Germany to catastrophe. He was implicated, however loosely, in the July 20th, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. When the plot failed, the Gestapo came for him. He was given the option that the regime extended to the famous a show trial, public disgrace and execution, or a state funeral, protection for his family, and a quiet death by his own hand. He took the cyanide capsule on October 14, 1944. He wore his Afrika Korps jacket. He carried his field marshal's baton. He was 52 years old. The image that stays with you after all of this is still that Christmas afternoon on the Libyan plain, the staff car, the herd of gazelles breaking across the scrub, the pistol raised, the shot taken. Military history tends to measure commanders by their victories. The maps, they changed. The armies they defeated, the objectives they seized. Rommel scored brilliantly by those measures for 2 years. He drove the British back and forth across 500 miles of desert, more times than most campaigns cover in their entire arc. He made his enemies believe they were facing something supernatural, something that operated outside the normal rules of war. But if you want to understand a campaign, a real campaign, not a legend, you look at the logistics, you look at what a general's army is eating on Christmas Day. You look at whether the supply ships are getting through. You look at whether the fuel is arriving in time for the tanks to move. Rommel's army in December 1942 was shooting gazelles with pistols from moving cars and gratefully accepting captured enemy coffee as a holiday gift. That is not the image of a force that is winning. That is the image of a force that has been outrun, not by the enemy's generals, but by the enemy's industry, their navy, their air force, and their ability to keep ships sailing unhindered across 1,400 miles of ocean. The Desert Fox was a genius. He was also a man fighting a war he was never truly given the means to win. The pistol shot on Christmas Day 1942 is the precise moment where those two facts intersect, where the genius and the impossibility of the situation come together in a single, almost poetic image. A great commander hunting for food with a combat weapon in a desert that was no longer his. That is the real story of the Desert Fox. Not the goggles, not the Knight's Cross, not the brilliant flanking maneuver at Gazelle. This, a pistol, a gazelle, and a man who understood, even as he pulled the trigger, that the campaign he had fought for 2 years was already over. If this story moved you, if it gave you something real to think about, history that goes deeper than the headlines, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a comment below. What aspect of Rommel's story surprised you most? Tell us in the comments. Hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And share this with someone who thinks they know the story of the Desert Fox. The real story is always more interesting than the legend.